German laborers, shocked by American butter, fruit, and endless sugar. The morning of May 9, 1945 arrived cold and gray over the shattered remnants of what had once been the Third Reich. In a makeshift processing camp near Regensburg, Bavaria, thousands of German soldiers stood in muddy columns, their Feldgrau uniforms torn and filthy, their faces hollow with exhaustion and defeat. The air smelled of wet canvas, unwashed bodies, and something else, something unfamiliar, that drifted from the American field kitchens beyond the wire. It was the scent of frying bacon, of fresh bread, of coffee so rich it seemed impossible in a world that had been starving for years. One young Wehrmacht corporal, his name lost to history but his testimony preserved in occupation archives, would later write that he thought he was hallucinating. He had not seen real butter in 3 years. He had not tasted sugar that wasn't ersatz, synthetic, derived from coal or sawdust, since 1942, and yet there it was, wafting through the spring air like a memory from a life he had almost forgotten existed. The war in Europe had ended just hours before. Adolf Hitler was dead. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted precisely 12 years and 4 months. And now, in the chaos of surrender and the first uncertain hours of occupation, these men, farmers, factory workers, schoolteachers conscripted into a war they had lost, were about to encounter something that would shake the foundations of everything they had been taught to believe. They were about to discover that the enemy they had been told was weak, decadent, and on the verge of collapse, had been eating better than they ever had. Even in peacetime, they were about to learn that the propaganda they had consumed for over a decade was not merely exaggerated, but inverted. The Americans, they would soon realize, had been fighting a war on 2 oceans, supplying half the world, and still had so much food that they threw away more in a single day than a German family might see in a month. This is the story of that discovery. This is the story of what happened when ideology collided with abundance, when years of carefully constructed lies met the simple, undeniable reality of a sugar bowl on a table. This is the story of butter. To understand the shock of that morning, one must first understand the Germany these men came from. Not the Germany of Leni Riefenstahl's propaganda films, all torchlight and triumphant marches, but the Germany of ration cards and hunger winters. The Germany where ersatz had become a way of life. By 1939, even before the first shots of the war were fired, the average German diet had already begun to contract. The Nazi regime, for all its bombast about strength and purity, had built an economy that could not feed its own people without conquest. Butter, that simple staple of European life, had become a luxury. Hermann Göring himself, in a speech in 1936, had sneered at those who complained, declaring that guns would make Germany great, not butter. "Guns will make us powerful," he said. "Butter will only make us fat." The German people had accepted the trade, or perhaps they had no choice but to accept it. Either way, the butter disappeared. In its place came margarine. And not the margarine of later decades, refined and palatable, but a grayish substance made from coal tar derivatives and whale oil, something that tasted vaguely of fish and left a waxy coating in the mouth. Sugar became beet syrup laced with saccharin. Coffee became roasted acorns and barley. Chocolate vanished entirely, replaced by carob powder that tasted like sweetened dirt. By 1942, even these substitutes were growing scarce. The German Hausfrau, the housewife lionized in Nazi propaganda as the bedrock of Aryan civilization, spent her days standing in queues for bread that was 30% sawdust and meat that was often horse meat, when it could be had at all. The ration cards told the story in cold mathematics. In 1944, a German civilian was entitled to 350 grams of meat per week, 250 grams of butter or margarine per month, and 200 grams of sugar. This was the official ration. The reality was often far less. Farmers hoarded. The black market thrived. And always, the propaganda machine insisted that Germany was winning, that the enemy was starving, that soon the final victory would bring abundance. The German soldiers who marched into Russia in 1941 had been told they would be greeted as liberators and would feast on the riches of the East. Instead, they found a Soviet population as hungry as they were, and they learned to survive on potatoes and stolen grain. The soldiers who dug into the Atlantic Wall in France ate fish and hoarded tins of sardines. Those who fought in Italy learned to barter cigarettes for olives and hard cheese. Everywhere, the German military machine scraped and scavenged, stretched and substituted. And through it all, the propaganda told them that America was weak, that America was a mongrel nation of gangsters and Jews, fat and lazy, incapable of sacrifice, that American soldiers were soft boys who would crumble at the first taste of real combat, that the American economy was a bubble built on speculation and Hollywood illusions, bound to collapse under the weight of war. German newsreels showed breadlines from the Great Depression, years out of date, and presented them as current events. Radio broadcasts mocked American culture, American music, American food. The Americans, they were told, had no stomach for war. They would sue for peace. They would negotiate. They would never have the will to cross an ocean and fight in Europe. This was the lie these men had lived inside. And on that cold morning in May 1945, the lie was about to crack open like an egg. The first meal came without ceremony. The American soldiers, themselves exhausted from weeks of rapid advance through Germany, simply opened the field kitchens and began serving. There were no speeches, no propaganda efforts, no attempts at re-education. Just food. The German prisoners shuffled forward in lines. Each man handed a metal tray divided into sections. And then, one by one, the sections were filled. First came bread. Not the dense, dark sawdust loaves they had known, but white bread, soft and fine-textured, made from real wheat flour. Some of the men later reported that they thought it was cake. Then came meat, actual meat, not horse meat or mystery tins, but thick slices of ham and beef, still warm. Vegetables followed, canned but recognizable, corn and beans and carrots. And then, in a moment that would be seared into the memory of every man who experienced it, came the butter. It sat in small, rectangular pats on wax paper, golden yellow, glistening slightly under the gray sky. Real butter. Dairy butter. Some of the younger soldiers, those who had been conscripted in 1943 or 44, had genuinely forgotten what butter looked like. They stared at it, uncertain whether they were meant to eat it or if this was some kind of test. An American corporal, noticing the hesitation, made a spreading motion with his hand and smiled. "Go ahead, buddy," he said in English that none of them understood. "It's yours." One man spread it on his bread and bit down. The taste, rich, creamy, faintly sweet, made his eyes water. Another simply ate the pat whole, letting it melt on his tongue. A third wrapped his portion carefully in paper and put it in his pocket, convinced that there would be no more, that this was a singular gift not to be wasted. But the American soldier came by again with a box and offered another pat. And then another. The supply seemed endless. And then came the sugar bowl. Not a packet, not a carefully measured ration, but an actual bowl filled with white crystalline sugar, sitting on a table near the coffee urns. A spoon stuck out of it. The prisoners stared. One man, a former schoolteacher from Hamburg named Klaus Dietrich, whose account would later be published in a 1953 memoir, approached the bowl as if it were a religious artifact. He took the spoon and measured out a single teaspoon into his coffee cup, glancing around nervously as if expecting to be stopped. No one stopped him. He took another spoonful. Still, nothing. A third. The American soldier manning the coffee urn shrugged and gestured at the bowl as if to say, "Take all you want." Dietrich would later write that he took 6 spoonfuls before his hand began to shake so badly he had to stop. "I realized in that moment," he wrote, "that we had lost more than the war. We had lost reality itself. The fruit came at lunch. Oranges, bright and impossibly fresh. Apples that actually crunched when bitten. Canned peaches in heavy syrup. Bananas, which many of the men had not seen since childhood, before the war, before the Depression. When such things still came from the tropics, a Wehrmacht lieutenant named Friedrich Müller, captured at Remagen in March, would testify in Allied occupation interviews that he had assumed the oranges were being distributed from some captured German warehouse, that this was a one-time windfall. But the next day, there were more oranges. And the day after that, and the day after that. It began to dawn on us, Müller said, that this was not special. This was normal for them. This was how they ate every day. The realization did not come all at once. It accumulated, piece by piece, meal by meal. It came in the form of white bread that appeared at every breakfast. It came in the chocolate bars that American soldiers handed out to children, casual and thoughtless, the way one might give away pebbles. It came in the cigarettes, American cigarettes, not the harsh Turkish or Bulgarian tobacco the Germans had choked on, but smooth Virginia tobacco that tasted like it had been grown in paradise. It came in the casual waste, the food scraped into garbage bins, still edible. More food thrown away than a German family would eat in a week. The prisoners began to gather near the trash bins. Not to scavenge, though some did, but simply to stare, to try to comprehend the scale of it. One man, a former factory worker from Essen named Otto Schmidt, interviewed by American psychological warfare officers in June 1945, described watching an American soldier throw away half a sandwich. It had meat in it, Schmidt said. Real meat, and cheese, and that white bread. He took 2 bites and threw it away because he said he wasn't hungry. I watched it land in the bin, and I thought, that sandwich would have fed my family for 2 days, and he just threw it away. He didn't even think about it. Schmidt paused in the interview, the transcript notes, and then added, that was when I understood that we had been lied to about everything. The psychological impact of this revelation cannot be overstated. These were not stupid men. They were not all fanatical Nazis. Many had been skeptical of the regime, had quietly doubted the propaganda, had understood on some level that the news from the front was being sanitized and spun. But doubt is not the same as knowledge. Suspicion is not the same as proof. And now, confronted with the physical, tangible, undeniable evidence of American abundance, the entire edifice of Nazi ideology began to collapse in their minds. The propaganda had told them that America was a decadent nation on the brink of ruin. But how could a nation on the brink of ruin field millions of soldiers, equipped with weapons and vehicles that made German equipment look like museum pieces, and feed them so well that they threw food away? The propaganda had told them that the American economy was a Jewish conspiracy, hollow and artificial. But how could a hollow economy produce so much real wealth, so much actual food, so much steel and rubber and fuel? The propaganda had told them that the German soldier was superior, that German discipline and German will would triumph over American softness. But they had lost. They had been beaten, and their conquerors were eating butter. The butter became symbolic. In the months that followed, as Germany was divided into occupation zones, and the long process of denazification began, the butter kept appearing, in mess halls and field kitchens, in the homes of Germans who worked for the occupation authorities, in the packages sent from America to feed the starving civilian population. It was everywhere, golden and impossible, a rebuke to everything Göring had said, everything Hitler had promised. Guns had not made Germany powerful. Guns had destroyed Germany, and the nation that had chosen butter, that had somehow managed to produce both guns and butter, had won. The sugar bowl became a legend. Stories circulated among the prisoners, passed from camp to camp, embellished and mythologized. There was a sugar bowl at every American meal. You could take as much as you wanted. No one stopped you. No one rationed it. One man claimed to have seen an American soldier put 5 spoonfuls of sugar in his coffee and then throw the coffee away because it was too sweet. Another swore he had seen a 50-pound sack of sugar split open by accident, spilling onto the ground. And the Americans had simply swept it up and thrown it away, rather than try to salvage it. Whether these stories were true hardly mattered. They felt true. They fit with what the men were experiencing, with the reality that was replacing the propaganda in their minds. And the fruit, the fresh fruit, the canned fruit, the fruit that kept coming in endless supply became a measure of something deeper than mere abundance. Fruit was perishable. Fruit was delicate. Fruit required infrastructure, refrigeration, transportation networks that functioned smoothly, even in wartime. The fact that American soldiers in Germany in 1945 were eating fresh oranges meant that somewhere, thousands of miles away, oranges were being picked and packed and shipped across an ocean and delivered to the front lines without spoiling. It meant that the American logistical system was so robust, so efficient, that it could treat oranges as expendable. A German general, interrogated at Nuremberg, was asked what he thought had been Germany's greatest miscalculation. He replied, "We did not understand that America could fight a war with fresh fruit." The historical record bears this out with cold, precise numbers. In 1944, at the height of the war, the United States produced 61% of the world's oil, 57% of its steel, and 43% of its electricity. It built nearly 100,000 aircraft that year alone. It launched a new naval vessel, on average, every day. It sent millions of tons of food to Britain, to the Soviet Union, to liberated France, through Lend-Lease and UNRWA and a dozen other programs. And through all of this, the American civilian population never went hungry. Rationing existed. Yes, sugar and butter and meat were rationed, but the rations were generous by any European standard. An American family in 1944 received more sugar per month than a German family received in 3 months. American schoolchildren drank milk every day. American workers could still buy steaks, albeit with ration points, and at higher prices. The American home front was not a paradise, but it was so far removed from the German experience that the two might as well have been different planets. The German leadership had known this, or should have known it. German intelligence reports from before the war had documented American industrial capacity. German economists had warned that America's economy was an order of magnitude larger than Germany's, that entering a long war with the United States would be suicide. But ideology had overridden analysis. The Nazis had convinced themselves that American wealth was an illusion, that it would evaporate under pressure, that a nation of mongrels and immigrants could never match the discipline and will of the Aryan race. They had been wrong. Catastrophically, utterly wrong. The prisoners in the camps began to piece this together. They traded rumors and scraps of information. They compared notes. The men who had fought on the Western Front told stories of being bombed around the clock by waves of American aircraft so numerous they darkened the sky. The men who had served in logistics told of trying to move supplies with horse-drawn carts, while American trucks, endless columns of them, rolled past on the highways. The U-boat survivors spoke of American shipyards that could replace losses faster than the submarines could sink them. And all of them, eventually, came back to the food. Because the food was the thing you could touch, taste, measure. A German doctor, assigned to work in an American-run hospital in Frankfurt in July 1945, wrote in his journal about the first time he entered the staff cafeteria. "I saw a table," he wrote, "perhaps 10 meters long, covered with food. There were platters of meat, bowls of salad, baskets of bread, cakes, and pies and puddings, and at the end, a bowl of butter pats and a bowl of sugar cubes, both just sitting there, unguarded. I asked a nurse if this was a special occasion, a celebration of some kind. She looked at me strangely and said, 'No, this is just lunch.' I realized then that I had spent 6 years serving a regime that had starved its own people to build weapons that could not defeat an enemy who ate like this for lunch. 17. The butter, the sugar, the fruit, These were not merely symbols of abundance. They were symbols of a different way of organizing society, a different set of priorities, a different relationship between government and citizen. The Nazi regime had demanded sacrifice. It had exalted sacrifice, made it a virtue, insisted that the individual existed only to serve the state. The German people had been told that going without butter was noble, that suffering was character-building, that the collective good required individual pain, and they had accepted it. Or at least they had endured it, because they believed it would lead to victory, to greatness, to a better future. But the Americans had not sacrificed in the same way. Or rather, they had sacrificed. They had sent millions of men to fight and die. They had rationed and worked and bought war bonds. But their sacrifice had not meant deprivation. Their government had not demanded that they go without in order to prove their worthiness. Instead, the American government had mobilized the vast productive capacity of the nation to ensure that both the military and the civilian population were fed, clothed, equipped. The American system, for all its flaws and inequalities, had been able to produce both guns and butter. It had not needed to choose. This was the deeper lesson that some of the German prisoners began to grasp. The material abundance was shocking, but the implications of that abundance were more shocking still. If a democratic system, a capitalist system, could outproduce a totalitarian command economy so thoroughly that the difference was visible in every meal, then perhaps the totalitarian system was not, in fact, superior. Perhaps the individual freedoms that the Nazis had mocked as weakness were actually a source of strength. Perhaps a society that did not crush its people, that allowed them to innovate and create and prosper, could generate more wealth, more power, more actual capability than a society built on obedience and fear. Not every prisoner reached this conclusion. Many remained bitter, convinced that Germany had been betrayed from within, that the Wehrmacht had been stabbed in the back by politicians or Jews or communists, that the war had been lost by everyone except the soldiers themselves. But for a significant number, the experience of American abundance planted seeds of doubt that would eventually grow into something larger. These men would go home to a ruined Germany, to cities that were 70% rubble, to an economy that had collapsed, to a population that was starving. And they would remember the butter. They would remember the sugar bowl. They would remember that the enemy who had destroyed their country had done so while eating fresh oranges. The occupation authorities did not initially understand the psychological impact of their rations. To the American soldiers, the food they were serving was ordinary, standard military fare, nothing special. They had no frame of reference for what German rations had been like, no real understanding of how deeply the Nazi propaganda had warped German perceptions of the outside world. It was only gradually, through the work of psychological warfare officers and intelligence analysts, that the pattern became clear. The prisoners were being re-educated not through lectures or films, but through their stomachs. General Lucius Clay, who would later become the military governor of the American occupation zone, wrote in his memoirs about a conversation he had with a captured German officer in June 1945. The officer, a colonel who had commanded a panzer regiment in France, had been cooperative and professional, but distant, clearly still loyal to Germany, if not to the Nazi regime. Clay had invited him to dinner, partly as a courtesy and partly to continue the debriefing. The meal was simple by American standards: pork chops, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread and butter, apple pie for dessert. The German officer ate in silence, slowly, clearly savoring every bite. At the end of the meal, Clay offered him coffee and pushed the sugar bowl across the table. The officer stared at it for a long moment, then looked up at Clay. "How long have you had sugar like this?" he asked. "The whole war," Clay replied. The officer nodded slowly. "Then we never had a chance," he said. "We were fighting an enemy we could not even imagine." This conversation, or versions of it, played out thousands of times across occupied Germany in the summer of 1945, in interrogation rooms and mess halls, in hospitals and work camps, in the quiet moments when German prisoners and American soldiers actually talked to each other rather than simply coexisting. The reality of the war's outcome became clear. Germany had not lost because it had been betrayed. It had not lost because of bad luck, or bad weather, or a few key mistakes. It had lost because it had gone to war with nations that possessed industrial and agricultural capacity so far beyond its own that the outcome had never really been in doubt. The courage of the German soldier, the tactical brilliance of the German officer corps, the technological sophistication of German weapons, none of it had mattered in the face of that fundamental imbalance. You could not win a modern war if your soldiers were eating sawdust bread and your enemy's soldiers were eating fresh fruit. The records from the occupation period are filled with small moments that illuminate this realization. A German prisoner watching an American soldier casually light a cigarette with a disposable lighter and then throw the lighter away when it ran out, not bothering to refill it. A German mechanic examining an American Jeep and marveling that it had been designed to be disposable, to be used hard and then replaced, because replacing it was cheaper than maintaining it. A German nurse working in an American field hospital discovering that the Americans threw away syringes after one use, that they had so many syringes they could afford to never reuse them. Each of these moments was a small shock, a tiny crack in the edifice of Nazi ideology. And the cracks accumulated. The fruit was perhaps the most powerful symbol of all, because fruit was universal. Everyone knew what an orange was. Everyone knew what an apple tasted like. You could not fake fruit. You could not create propaganda fruit. The orange in your hand was either real or it was not. And if it was real, if you were eating a fresh orange in the middle of Germany in May 1945, then the system that had produced that orange and transported it to you was also real. The system was undeniable. A German farmer from the Rhineland, interviewed in August 1945 as part of a survey on civilian attitudes, told his American interrogator about the first time he received food aid from the occupation authorities. It was a box of rations, standard American civilian relief supplies, canned meat, powdered milk, flour, sugar, and a small sack of dried apples. I took the apples, he said, and I soaked them in water overnight, the way my wife used to do before the war when we had dried fruit. In the morning, they had plumped up, and I ate one. It tasted like an apple. A real apple, not ersatz, not turnips with flavoring, but an actual apple that had grown on a tree somewhere. And I thought about where that apple had come from. It had been grown in America, I suppose, or maybe California. I did not know American geography. It had been dried and packaged and put in a box with food from all over America. It had been loaded onto a ship and sent across an ocean full of submarines. It had been unloaded at a port that we had destroyed with bombs, and that the Americans had rebuilt in a matter of weeks. It had been trucked across Germany on roads that we had also destroyed and that the Americans had also rebuilt. And it had been given to me, a German farmer who had probably grown food that fed the soldiers who fought against America. They gave it to me for free. No one asked me if I had been a Nazi. No one demanded anything in return. They just gave it to me. The farmer paused, and the interrogator noted that he was crying. I had been told that the Americans were monsters, he continued. I had been told that if they won, they would enslave us, starve us, destroy us. And instead, they gave me an apple. This was the power of the food. It was not just that it was abundant, it was that it was given. The Americans were not hoarding their butter and sugar. They were not eating fresh fruit while Germans starved in order to demonstrate their dominance. They were feeding the prisoners. They were feeding the civilians. They were, in fact, feeding the very people who had been trying to kill them just weeks before. The Marshall Plan was still years away, but the instinct behind it, the idea that a prosperous, well-fed Germany was better for everyone than a starving, resentful Germany was already visible in the field kitchens of May 1945. Not everyone understood this. Not everyone accepted it. There were German prisoners who believed the Americans were trying to fatten them up before doing something terrible. There were civilians who thought the food aid was a trick, a way to make Germans dependent so that they could be controlled more easily. Bitterness and suspicion did not disappear overnight. But the food kept coming. Week after week, month after month, the Americans kept feeding the Germans. And slowly, grudgingly, the suspicion began to fade. You could only believe that the food was a trick for so long before you had to admit that maybe, just maybe, it was not a trick. Maybe the Americans actually meant it. Maybe they actually believed that feeding your enemies was not weakness but strategy. That you could win a peace the same way you won a war by having more resources and using them more intelligently than anyone else. By the end of 1945, 6 months after the surrender, the pattern was undeniable. The American occupation zone, despite being filled with refugees and displaced persons and returned prisoners, was eating better than any part of Germany had eaten since before the war. The black market still existed, but it was shrinking. The ration system still existed, but the rations were adequate. Children were gaining weight. The death rate from starvation was dropping, and everywhere, in every town and city, Germans were encountering American abundance, in the PX stores where American soldiers shopped, in the officers' clubs where German women worked as cleaners, in the Quonset huts and prefab buildings where the occupation bureaucracy was setting up shop. The Americans brought their lifestyle with them, and it was impossible to ignore. A German journalist, one of the first to be licensed to publish in the American zone, wrote an editorial in October 1945 that captured the mood. "We were told," he wrote, "that we were fighting for our survival, that the enemy wanted to destroy us, that only total victory or total annihilation were possible. But now, the enemy is here. And he is not destroying us. He is feeding us. He is rebuilding our factories, reopening our schools, clearing the rubble from our streets. He is not perfect, he makes mistakes, he is sometimes arrogant, he does not always understand us. But he is not the monster we were promised. And his food, his endless, impossible food, is proof that we were lied to. Every meal is a sermon against fascism. Every sugar bowl is a hymn to democracy. We lost the war in the trenches and the factories, but we lost the peace in the kitchens. We were defeated by butter." 2. This was perhaps overstated. The American occupation was not universally benevolent, and the food situation in Germany remained precarious for years. The terrible winter of 1946 and 1947, the hunger winter, would bring widespread malnutrition back to much of the country. But the journalist's essential point was correct. The ideological defeat of Nazism was not accomplished primarily through war crimes, trials, or denazification programs, or political lectures. It was accomplished through the simple, relentless demonstration that the Nazi worldview had been wrong. Wrong about race, wrong about democracy, wrong about economics, wrong about America. And nowhere was that wrongness more viscerally evident than in the contrast between what Germans had been told about American weakness and what they were experiencing every day in the occupation zones. The butter remained a touchstone. Even years later, decades later, the Germans, who had lived through the occupation, remembered the butter. It appeared in memoirs and oral histories, in novels and films, in the collective memory of a generation. The butter the Americans gave us became shorthand for a whole complex of emotions: shame at having been defeated, gratitude for not having been destroyed, wonder at the abundance of the victors, anger at having been lied to by their own leaders. The butter was not just food. It was the physical manifestation of a turning point, the moment when the Nazi narrative finally, irrevocably collapsed. One woman, interviewed for a television documentary in 1985, 40 years after the war's end, still remembered with perfect clarity the first time she was given butter by an American soldier. She had been 17 years old, fleeing westward ahead of the Soviet advance, when she stumbled into an American checkpoint near Marburg. She was starving, exhausted, barely able to stand. The American soldiers gave her water, Then food, white bread with butter. Real butter. She had not tasted it in years. "I sat on the side of the road," she said in the interview, her voice still filled with emotion after 4 decades. "And I ate that bread. And I cried. Not because I was grateful to the Americans, though I was. Not because I was relieved to be alive, though I was. But because I realized that I had spent 6 years of my life, the years when I should have been going to school, falling in love, becoming an adult. I had spent those years suffering for a lie. My father had died in Russia for a lie. My brother had died in France for a lie. And the people who had told us that lie had been eating sawdust bread themselves, while the people they said were our enemies had butter. I cried because I understood, for the first time, how completely we had been betrayed. This was the true shock of American butter, the true revelation of the sugar bowl and the fresh fruit. It was not just that Germany had lost the war. Germany had lost the war because its entire society had been organized around principles that were fundamentally flawed, that led inevitably to weakness rather than strength, to scarcity rather than abundance, to defeat rather than victory. The Nazi ideology had promised that sacrifice would lead to greatness, that suffering would forge a master race, that ruthlessness and will would overcome any material disadvantage. But it had all been backwards. The society that had allowed its people freedom and comfort had been stronger. The economy that had produced consumer goods alongside weapons had been more resilient. The nation that had not demanded total sacrifice had been more willing to sacrifice when it mattered. America had won the war because it was a better system. And the butter proved it. And so the story ends where it began, with a sugar bowl on a table. Such a simple thing, so mundane that the American soldiers who placed it there probably never gave it a second thought. Just sugar. Available for anyone who wanted it. No ration cards required. But to the German prisoners who encountered it in May 1945, it was a revelation. It was proof that the world they thought they knew did not exist, had never existed. It was proof that they had been living inside a lie. In the years that followed, those men went home and rebuilt their country. They cleared the rubble and reopened the factories. They participated in the Marshall Plan and joined NATO and eventually created the Federal Republic of Germany, a democracy allied with the very nations that had defeated them. And many of them, when asked why they had accepted this transformation so readily, why they had turned their backs on the regime they had fought for, would think of that sugar bowl. They would think of the butter, the fruit, the endless American abundance that had seemed so impossible. They would remember that the enemy had fed them when they were starving, had given them sugar when they had been told sugar did not exist. The lesson was simple, almost too simple to be believed. A society that treats its people well, that allows them to prosper, that does not demand they suffer for the glory of the state, is a society that will be strong when strength is needed. A government that provides butter as well as guns is a government that can win wars. Freedom is not weakness. Abundance is not decadence. Democracy is not a luxury reserved for peacetime. These truths, self-evident to the Americans who had grown up taking them for granted, had to be learned the hard way by the Germans who had been taught the opposite. And they learned it, in the end, from a sugar bowl. The ideological battle of the Second World War was not won at Normandy or Stalingrad, not in the conference rooms at Yalta or the courtrooms at Nuremberg. It was won in 1,000 mess halls and field kitchens. In the moment when a German prisoner spread real butter on white bread and understood that he had been lied to. It was won by logistics and agriculture, by supply chains and industrial capacity, by the sheer material fact of American abundance. The Americans defeated the Nazis not just by being willing to fight, but by being able to fight while still eating fresh fruit. They won because their system was better. And the butter proved it. In the end, that is what the German laborers and soldiers discovered in May 1945, when they encountered American butter, fruit, and endless sugar for the first time. They discovered that the war had been lost before it began, that the enemy they had been taught to despise was stronger in every way that mattered, and that the ideology they had served was not just evil, but stupid. They discovered that the sugar bowl sitting on the table, unguarded and plentiful, was more devastating to Nazi propaganda than 1,000 Allied bombers. They discovered that sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply the truth, made tangible in the form of something as simple and profound as butter. And that truth, once encountered, could never be unlearned. It would shape the rebuilding of Germany, the Cold War, the creation of modern Europe. It would echo through history as a reminder that material reality cannot be overcome by ideology, that lies will eventually collide with facts, and that a nation's true strength is measured not in how much its people can endure, but in how well they can live. The butter was not just food. It was proof, and proof, in the end, was irresistible.